Hey, what's going on guys? My name is Rampage and welcome to my GPU comparison video between my GTX 770 and my GTX 970. Now keep in mind my GTX 770 is a 2GB model and the 970 is a 4GB model, so sometimes you'll see results that kind of don't really make sense, and that's because my GTX 770 is actually running out of VRAM. Now the first game that I benchmarked is Batman Arkham Origins at 1080p, FXAA high, everything on DX11 enhanced that I could, physics on high. Now my settings in the benchmark results is the same as what I just said, except with AA set to FXAA high and motion blur disabled. So as you can see here, the blue is the GTX 770, which on stock gives you an 82 or maximum FPS of 82 and a maximum of 95 on the 970, OC 86 and 104. So you can see a slight increase between both stock and OC with both cards, but the overclock gives you a better FPS result on, or a higher result for the OC on the GTX 970. Now with my settings, I get a maximum of 118 on the GTX 770 and a maximum of 139 frames per second. Now keep in mind, I will have all of the minimum and average frame rates in the description below, so you guys can compare and whatnot. See everything in the description. I'm going to have all of it, because if I said all the minimum, average and maximum for each, both stock, OC and my settings, I tried this before and it nearly went for about 30 minutes, so I'm not going to do that again. But yeah, so there's those results for Batman Arkham Origins, which I'm actually enjoying the overall FPS gain from the GTX 970 so far. Now the next game is Metro Last Light. Now keep in mind these are all synthetic benchmarks, so you'll probably get better results in-game, but you know, whatever. For synthetic benchmarks, these are probably the better thing to do. But anyway, Metro Last Light, the benchmark is kind of ridiculous, so I'll show you my sort of settings, or sort of my frame rates that I think are viable, and then I'll have the actual benchmark results that I actually got from the benchmark on the screen as well, so you can see all of the dips and spikes and shit like that. I don't count most of them, so yeah, I count consistent frame rates rather than significant drops or highs. But anyway, stock for the GTX 770 gives you a 52 maximum and the GTX 970 65, whereas with the OC you gain 3 frames per second, let me get it right, of 55 frames per second, and a maximum on the GTX 970 71 frames per second. So it's a more of an increase once again with the GTX 970, whereas the 770 gives you a maximum or higher FPS of about 3 FPS. Now keep in mind that there are a lot of spikes and shit like that I do not count, so take that with a grain of salt. But anyway, my settings for the GTX 970 were same as above, but with SSAA off and motion blur to low, because for some reason in that one you can't actually turn it off. The maximum with those settings is 92 FPS, with the GTX 970 getting 120. Now keep in mind it was getting more than that, but I didn't count that shit. So that 120 was basically the highest consistent FPS that it got. Keep in mind it wasn't for very long, but if you want to count the consistent frame rate, it's about 110 frames per second. So you know, it's better. It's still better. So whatever. The next benchmark is Sleeping Dogs. So Sleeping Dogs was completely maxed out with 1080p, AA Extreme, high-res textures on, shadow resolution at high, shadow filtering high, SSAO high, and motion blur maxed out. With my settings, same as what I just said, except with AA turned to normal, and you'll see the huge FPS gain when you turn AA back to normal rather than keeping it on extreme, because extreme uses, I think, SSAA and then SSAA 2 times or something like that for extreme. I don't know, whatever. Motion blur completely off. So for stock with the GTX 770 you get 76 frames per second, and for the 970 102, whereas the overclock gets you 81 and 114. So both of them give you a better result with the overclock, which is nice, because some games don't actually like that and they kind of give you a little incremental difference, but this one gives you a nice increase, which is good. But with my settings for the GTX 770 you get 231 frames per second, and the 970 you get 262. So once again, I just do want to say that all these averages and minimum frame rates from the actual benchmarks will be in the description below, so you guys can check all of them out. But anyway, the next benchmark is Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor at 1080p, lighting at high, mesh at ultra, motion blur camera plus objects, shadows ultra, texture resolution or texture filtering at ultra, textures at ultra, ambient occlusion ultra, vegetation range at ultra, depth of field on, order independent translucency, whatever the hell that is, on, tessellation on. Now my settings are kind of weird because in order to actually get a decent increase for my GTX 770, I actually had to turn a lot of things down. I turned motion blur off, shadows at medium, textures at high, ambient occlusion at medium, and depth of field off. So you can see the difference here. The stock for the GTX 770 is 58, whereas the OC, for some reason, gives me 44. Not sure why that is. I believe it's got something to do with trying to swap out textures and stuff like that. But I have no idea why it actually went down. It doesn't really make sense. And I got a lower minimum FPS as well, like overall. So not too sure what was going on there. But the GTX 970 for stock, I get 94. With the overclock, 103. Now with my settings, the GTX 770 gained or got 109 as the max, and the 970 got 155 frames per second. So, you know, there's a significant jump when you turn a lot of things down. But once again, you can see all the minimum and average in the description below. Whew. Anyway, the next game is Thief. 1080p, texture resolution or texture quality very high, shadow quality very high, depth of field high, texture filtering AF 16 times, SSAA on high, screen space reflection on, parallax occlusion mapping on, FXAA on, contact hardening shadows on, and tessellation on. My settings, same as what I just said, except with SSAA turned off. So the stock for the GTX 770 is 76, whereas the overclock gives you an extra 2 frames. Now with the GTX 970, the max was 98, with a gain of about 3 frames per second at 101. Now my settings, with SSAA turned off, for the GTX 770, 102 frames per second. Now the GTX 970 got 135 frames per second. So, you know, there's a lot of difference once again just by turning SSAA off. Now, the next game benchmark is Tomb Raider. 1080p, motion blur on, screen effects on, texture quality ultra, texture filtering AF 16 times, hair quality normal because TressFX, let's face it, is fucking garbage. And fucks with the results so much. 4 times SSAA, shadows ultra, shadow resolution high, level of detail ultra, reflections high, depth of field ultra, SSAO ultra, post-processing on, tessellation on, and high precision on. Now the GTX 770 gives you a max stock FPS of 52 frames per second, and with the overclock gives you 56. Now the GTX 970 gives you a maximum of 72 frames per second, with the overclock 80, so it's a gain of 8 frames per second. So it's not too bad. It's still doing better than the GTX 770 with the overclock, where the overclock gives you 4 frames. With my settings, with same as what I said before, but with post-processing and FXAA, I think I turned off SSAA. I don't know why I've got that there. But anyway, the GTX 770 gives you a maximum of 158 frames per second, whereas the GTX 970 gives you 193 frames per second. So once again, it's not doing too bad. Now the next results are for 3D Mark 11 Pro. Stock with the extreme profile, the default extreme profile on my GTX 770 is X3644. So not bad. With the overclock, 3912. Nice gain there. But with my GTX 970, the stock is X4888, whereas the overclock 5374. So there's a decent amount of increase there, especially on the overclock. Now for Unigine Heaven benchmark, stock on the GTX 770, 1144. The overclock gives you 1230. So not bad again. And I'll also show you every sort of detail-y bit for all of these benchmarks also in the description below. So you guys don't really, if you don't know what those results are for, then you'll probably like see the other markings as well for everything. But anyway, whatever. Unigine Heaven for my GTX 970, stock 1604. So it's a decent increase from the GTX 770 with the overclock of 1756. So once again, a lot of increase. Now the last benchmark result is Unigine Valley. Unigine Valley for my GTX 770 is 2516 with the overclock 2701. So that's not too bad results, but with the GTX 970 stock 2959, which completely beats out the 770's results with the overclock. The overclock for the 970 is 3211. So overall results, pretty good. I'm actually enjoying the 970, the increase in performance overall. But as I said before, you can see all the minimum, average, all of the sort of individual markings for all of these kind of benchmarks for 3D Mark 11, Pro, Unigine Heaven, and Unigine Valley in the description below. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this benchmarking video, and I don't plan to do like a lot of comparing videos because I don't really buy a hell of a lot of graphics cards. But this one only occurred because I actually had 2 graphics cards at the time. I haven't actually sold my GTX 770 yet. I don't know whether I will. I might actually use it as a physics card, but I will do physics performance with having a dedicated physics card on games that actually support it, because I'm curious to know what the actual difference is and on games that actually support it, obviously. But anyway, my name is Rampage. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe. I hope to see you again. Peace out.